So we've talked about matching in networks, where in some cases we match, for example, buyers and sellers, and we've talked about desirable properties of those matches, and in fact matching markets. What we want to talk about now is who gets the surplus. A match generates a surplus in many cases. The question is, how is that shared? One way to think about that is who has power in the match. And we want to think about that in the context of a network that includes typically more than just two people, more than just, say, one buyer and seller, or more than just two people who are going to be paired off somehow. And this concept of power, and in particular to the extent that it results from an individual's own characteristics versus the individual's position in their social network, is something that's studied a lot in sociology. The sociologist Richard Emerson observed that power is actually not so much a property of a person, but instead results from the relationship between two or more people. So we want to consider social relationships between people that produces value for them. So imagine, to begin with, just two people who might be matched up. They have a relationship. That relationship produces value if they're willing to be matched up. Question is, how does that value get split? That value might be something like revenue in an economic exchange, but it could be a social relationship, a friendship. And this could be either social or psychological value of that friendship. It could also be political power between two politicians who are matched up to try to accomplish some objective. We want to try to think about how that value that this match generates gets split up. How does it get divided? So let's start just thinking through this with a really simple example. Suppose we only have two people, A and B here, and A and B have an edge between them indicating they can form a relationship. Well, that relationship, if it forms, generates some value for A and B, and if we don't know anything about who A and B are, it seems reasonable to expect them to have equal power as their positions are symmetric, and they might be reasonably expected to divide the surplus generated by the relationship equally. That one's simple enough. Let's make it a little more complicated. Suppose we have three people, A, B, and C, with edges between A and B and C. And let's suppose that each person can be in only one relationship. Think about this, for example, as best friends. B can have a best friend of A or C. A, if he has a best friend, can only have B, and C, if there's a best friend, can only have B as that best friend. Well, in this setting, it seems pretty clear that B should be more powerful than A or C. A and C are relatively weak because B is their only alternative. But the real question is, how much more powerful is B than A or C? That one, too, is pretty easy to think about. But if we begin to make the social graph more complex, it gets much more complicated. Let's imagine this T-shaped graph where we have A, B, C, D, and E. Okay, and try to think about what happens here. So again, remember the idea is that every person can enter into at most one social exchange. They can be matched with at most one other person. Here, one other person is one other node. Let's suppose every social exchange generates one unit of surplus. So if I match, for example, A and B, there's a unit of surplus generated by that match, which they share between themselves. Question is, in this network, ignoring identities of the people filling those roles of the nodes A, B, C, D, and E, who is going to be powerful? Well, it seems reasonable to conjecture that D, who has the most edges, that is, has the highest degree, would be powerful because D has the ability to exclude A or C. And similarly, A, C, and E all look relatively weak because each of them only have one alternative, and their alternative has other alternatives. D looks sort of powerful, perhaps not as powerful as B. He doesn't have as many alternatives as B does, but he looks more powerful than E. If you begin to think about this, though, well, D's potential alternative to E is B, who seems to be powerful. Because of that, perhaps D is actually not all that powerful after all in his negotiations with E. But then that makes E not quite as weak as he might have seemed. And this, of course, is a network that only has 5 people in it. What happens is the network becomes more and more complicated. We want to try to figure out what it makes sense to predict here. And a nice way to start is to begin with some experiments. It's really hard to do this from real-world data because it's hard to identify the social network, to identify the surplus any relationship generates, and then to see how it's divided. But in the lab, this can be controlled. So we're going to look at what's called network exchange experiments, which sociologists have been doing for a long time. We'll think about an experiment in which a small group of people are in a lab and they play the role of the nodes in our social network. We'll identify a variety of social networks where every pair of connected nodes can enter into a social exchange, but every node can be part of only one exchange. There actually are more complicated experiments where people can be part of multiple exchanges, but we'll keep it with just one exchange for now. And we'll say that every exchange that anyone enters into generates a surplus of $1 that can be shared by the nodes in that exchange. That is, for example, if we match nodes A and B, who must have a link between them if we're going to match them, that generates a surplus of $1 that A and B have to share. Notice, of course, here we're turning everything into money, with the idea being that we're going to use money to represent whatever social surplus this exchange might generate. Also, anyone who doesn't get matched at all in the exchange gets 0. That's the baseline. We'll have these individuals in a lab, and they play this game for up to some time limit. And the way these experiments are typically run is they use instant messaging facilities on computer terminals. So they don't directly talk to each other, they just trade messages. Typically, you can trade messages just with the people you're linked to. Then this experiment is run, and after some time limit, it's stopped, and then it's repeated. And this is done over and over. And what the experimenters have done, these things have looked at then, is how is the money divided up after many rounds of these social exchanges. Now, there are actually lots of details I didn't describe here. One interesting detail that you might think matters, but it turns out not to make much difference, is information. It's natural, of course, to think that people have information about the opportunities of exchanging with the nodes that they're connected to. Otherwise, how are they going to exchange? But you could imagine giving them information about what's happening on other parts of the network that they're not directly connected to. Experimenters have played around with a variety of these information structures, and what they found is it makes very little difference. Next time, we'll look at a collection of these experiments and see what happens, and then try to generate some conjectures that we can turn into a theory of network exchange.